Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on Foundations of Supply Chain Due Diligence. I'm Tom, and I'll be moderating today's session. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. Whether you're new to supply chain due diligence or looking to strengthen your existing approach, today's session will provide you with practical insights and actionable steps to build more resilient, responsible supply chains. Before I dive in, let me walk through what we'll be covering in the next hour. First, we'll explore why supply chain due diligence has become absolutely critical for long-term business resilience. Then we'll get practical. We'll share some concrete steps you can take to map your supply chain and identify those key risk areas that matter most to your business. Next, we'll focus on how to embed a due diligence system directly into your business policies and processes. And finally, we'll wrap up with the Q&A session where you can ask our experts any questions about implementing these strategies within your own organization. So about SEDEX, for those who may be new to SEDEX, let me give you a quick overview of who we are and why we're uniquely positioned to guide you through this topic. SEDEX transforms supply chain due diligence into a strategic advantage. We operate across 180 countries with over 90,000 members and over 115,000 work sites on our platform, giving us 20 years of data and expertise in helping businesses map, assess, identify, and mitigate risks across your supply chains. With 7 regional offices spanning from London to Shanghai, Chicago to Madrid, we support businesses across 35 industries for our complete due diligence platform and professional services. SEDEX developed and owns the SMETA methodology, the world's most widely used ethical audit standard. This gives us unparalleled insights into supply chain risks and best practices across the globe. So whether you're starting your due diligence journey or looking to strengthen your existing programs, SEDEX provides the tool, data, and expert guidance to turn compliance requirements into a competitive advantage. Now, let me introduce you to our expert speakers who will be guiding us through today's content. We have Miranda, who is our principal consultant here at SEDEX. Miranda brings extensive experience in helping organizations develop and implement robust due diligence frameworks that not only meet regulatory requirements, but drive real business value. And also welcome James. James is our consultant at SEDEX, specializing in practical supply chain risk assessment and stakeholder engagement strategies. James works directly with our members to translate due diligence theory into actionable business practices. So let's dive into the foundations. James, I'll hand it over to you to walk us through what supply chain due diligence means in practice and why it's more critical than ever for business success.
Thanks, Tom. Firstly, starting with what is supply chain due diligence? So this is the process that companies use to identify, assess, prevent, and address environmental, social, and governance risks and impacts within their supply chain. So it's important to note that it's a proactive and ongoing process, and the aim is to ensure that the goods and services a company relies on are ethically and sustainably sourced. So it's about making sure your business isn't contributing directly or indirectly to harmful practices such as child labour or forced labour, deforestation or habitat destruction, pollution or greenhouse gas emissions as well. It's important to note it's a practical continuous process to address these human rights and environmental risks across the value chain. And the focus is on risk to people and planet, not just compliance. So you want to go beyond compliance as well and think about the actual risks to your business. And then knowing where your risks are and what to do about them is a really important step within this cycle, and we'll touch more on that later. So just a little example to bring this to life. If you were sourcing plastic packaging, for example, you might start to wonder, where is it made? Are the workers there being paid fairly? Are they working safe hours? And what is your business doing to check this and then also remediate these issues if it's not the case? If we look onto the left of the slide, one of the main standards which underpins this is the OECD guidance and the due diligence cycle there, which is comprised of 6 steps. So as I mentioned, it's a cycle and it's a circle, so it's a continuous process. So it focuses on these 6 steps. First one is embed responsible business conduct into policies and management systems, then identify and assess the adverse impacts, and then also provide for, cooperate in remediation if necessary. Then cease, prevent, or mitigate any impacts, track implementation, communicate how these impacts are addressed as well. And we'll touch more on these steps later on in this presentation. But just before we move on to the next slide, it's important to note that this due diligence cycle isn't just for multinational corporations, but it's the backbone of good practice for companies of all sizes. Next slide, please. So I won't go through these points in detail, but why does effective supply chain due diligence matter for your business? These are kind of 6 points, which we hear very frequently when we're talking to customers. So for example, there's increasing complexity in global supply chains. Businesses are having limited real-time visibility on their supply chains. They're worried about vulnerability to disruptions, cost pressures and inefficiencies, regulatory and compliance challenges, customer requirements, and consumer expectations. So these are just some of the common challenges that companies face, and it's often why they join SEDEX or why they work with us in the consulting team. So I thought I'd bring an example just to kind of bring this to life. So we worked to create a sustainable procurement program for a global battery provider and manufacturer sourcing goods that were containing conflict minerals. So they were struggling. They knew that there was incoming EU legislation, such as the EU CSDDD, which would require supply chain due diligence. And they were concerned that they'd be in scope of these due diligence laws, as well as ones concerning conflict minerals and battery materials. But they were unsure of their supply chain risks and unsure if they'd also be impacted by the UFLPA, which is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And it's a United States law aimed at preventing the importation of goods made with forced labor from the Xinjiang region in China. So yeah, basically they were concerned with compliance and understanding the risks in their supply chain. So what we did to help them was a legislation diagnostic to help them understand their legislative requirements, also a risk assessment of their direct and indirect supply chains. And then we used the results of this to create a responsible sourcing process for them, as well as a rollout plan and governance model to go alongside that, and updated their policies, including a complex mineral policy and creation of a battery materials policy. So this overall supported their compliance and made sure that they felt more confident in how to conduct the due diligence in their supply chain in a way that supported compliance, but also practically addressed the company's risk exposure. So yeah, next slide, please. It's important to note here that these risks aren't just abstract, but they also translate to real issues for companies, which can then be reported on as demonstrated by these headlines. And then obviously that presents a major reputational risk to operations. So it's important to try and mitigate that. The headlines here highlight multiple different types of risks. So for example, on conflict minerals with the cobalt headline on the left, modern slavery, climate impact and transparency are just some of the issues that these companies have been facing. And it's also important to note here that many of these headlines come from the UK, which many might consider a more low risk location, but it just shows the importance of acknowledging that low risk does not mean no risk. Yeah, I'll now hand over to Miranda to go into a little more depth on those laws.
Thanks, James. So in terms of good practice and how companies can keep themselves out of the headlines that James just mentioned, so the shift in the last couple of years has been from voluntary codes to mandatory due diligence. So bigger companies with more advanced ESG targets or programs might have been voluntarily committing to the principles outlined in the OECD guidance, which certainly is best practice for supply chain due diligence. But now we're seeing over the past couple of years a move in different jurisdictions towards mandatory due diligence expected by the regulators of those bigger companies. That could be focused on specific sectors. So, for example, the EU Deforestation Act, that focuses on high-risk goods as perceived by the EU. So coffee, soy, cattle, among some others. Or it could be focused on what is being imported. So, for example, the EU batteries regulation, which requires battery producers and retailers and importers to conduct due diligence of the supply chain, specifically focusing on the human rights risks associated with conflict minerals. In other jurisdictions, though, they're not focusing on specific sectors. As James mentioned, the US has import controls based on the origin of the goods rather than what they contain, although the border control has been focusing more on specific types of goods like cotton and tomatoes. Or it could just be a threshold based on revenue or size of company based on headcount, such as the EU CSDDD or the German Act. Now, we saw France and Germany and some other EU countries move first in this regard, and then since then the EU has implemented its own EU-wide law. I'm sure all of you have been reading about the proposed omnibus, which the EU aims to simplify this regulation with, and some of the EU member states that were preparing to transpose that law have now held off to see how that lands. We're not going to go into that in a huge amount of detail today, but we can always answer some questions later if that is of interest to anyone in the audience. But I think interestingly, looking outside the EU, only last week, Korea actually retabled a proposition to have its own mandatory due diligence law. And if passed, that would become Asia's first law of its kind. So we are expecting to see a trickle-down effect as other parts of the world aim to emulate what countries in the EU are aiming to do with mandating companies to conduct this due diligence and hold them account for the human rights and environmental impacts in their supply chain. In terms of the opportunities for companies here, we encourage our clients to see the levelling of the playing field as an opportunity and not just as a compliance action. So certainly the provision of more standardised best practice is a good thing for many sectors that have been navigating different levels of standards for many years now. And even if you're not big enough to be directly in scope of the laws, many companies will still be impacted by the trickle-down effect of the bigger companies in certain sectors from implementing these standards. And then the last thing I would say on the legislation side is that the risks of non-compliance are severe. So they can include substantial fines, potential civil liability for damages or reputational damage. And again, while you might not be in direct scope of this legislation, you will still be required to comply with your customer requests for data, for information, for transparency. So we do expect the imposition of these laws to bring up the standards of due diligence, regardless of how big your company is. If we go to the next slide, please. I think it's worth mentioning that the somewhat unclear or uneven or unpredictable regulatory picture has been met with mixed reactions from corporates and from the investor community as well. So while we have seen some retreat in some sectors by corporates from ESG targets and they hit the headlines and they're very prominent in the media, this hasn't been well received by some significant parts of the investor community. Some headlines here are some recent examples where investors are no longer satisfied with companies committing to minimal compliance, rolling back their targets, rolling back their programs in response to political upheaval. So on the left, we see Norges, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, calling for stronger, more refined European ESG regulations and actually imposing their own high standards of due diligence on the companies that they invest in, which is a significant amount of the European market. And so effectively going above and beyond that omnibus proposal, and they're actively defying that pushback to, exemplified by the EU to roll back the due diligence legislation, and they're actually doubling down on responsible investing. There's also here a reference to a sizable coalition pushing HSBC to stay committed to its net zero goals, which is also a clear indicator that they're looking for long-term sustainable value. So what this means is that the largest companies are likely to be incentivized to implement best practice aligned with the UNGPs and the OECD framework that James spoke through earlier. Although there are other benefits to this too for the businesses themselves in going about it in a kind of standardized best practice way, which is something that we discuss with our clients a lot, because what we find is that when sticking to minimum compliance, this can often lead to quite a confusing patchwork, decentralized approach to risk management. And for many companies, having a more standardized, centralized approach is beneficial. It also enables you to act proactively rather than leave you exposed to a reactive compliance-based approach. And it can help you ensure that you're the first ones to know when there is actually an issue in your supply chain. So if we go to the next slide, this leads me on to the other business benefits of due diligence. So if we all assume that it is a given that we want to do the right thing and the moral question for why this is a good idea is not in doubt, the real roadblock becomes, how can I get my business on board with this? So we also know that sometimes procurement KPIs around cost can also be in direct conflict with human rights ones. But ultimately, what we're aiming for is the integration of human rights considerations into business strategy and into procurement decision making. But before we get there, we need to help push human rights up the agenda and articulate how due diligence, especially in the supply chain, brings business benefits, not just socially and environmentally, but economically as well. So I'll just pick out some examples here. First, we've got supply chain resilience. By identifying and addressing risks early, like labour abuses or resource scarcity or weak governance, due diligence helps prevent disruption and reputational damage through accessing greater visibility, control, and agility in times of crisis. So we work a lot with our clients on improving that visibility of the risks they have in their supply chain. Secondly, I think innovation is a really interesting one. Working closely with your suppliers to improve practices can unlock new ways of doing things, from cleaner production methods to more inclusive sourcing models. So a more collaborative approach can lead to better products for you and your customers and stronger supplier relationships. And then third, cost reduction. So due diligence can highlight inefficiencies that you have, for example, excessive energy use, waste, or unsustainable procurement routes, which can directly impact that bottom line. So it can reduce your long-term risk exposure through that short-term upfront investment, I suppose, in resources and time, which can mean fewer surprises down the line and lower costs over time. So when we work with clients, they find that once they have their programs underway, there are a lot of unexpected benefits that come as a side benefit as well to their program. So I think if we move on now, we will be moving into the more practical part of our session. So we really want to help you visualize how this can look for your business. So if we go to the next slide, we've got a typical roadmap here for supply chain due diligence that we would work on with our clients. So first, we recommend to get your house in order. Develop clear policies on human rights, labour practices, and environmental responsibility. And James will talk us through policy setting in a bit more detail in a second. But I would say that securing leadership buy-in and assigning ownership is really important for this to be effective. And also, I would recommend that you hold yourselves to the same standards that you hold your suppliers to. So doing a review of the policies that apply to your own business is equally important. Next, you need to understand where your risks are. So not every company has the same footprint or capacity. So clarify what due diligence means based on your size, your sector, and your risk profile. Are you sourcing really high-risk goods? Are you planning to expand your business into a higher risk jurisdiction? And then set meaningful goals. For example, conducting risk screening across tier 1 suppliers this year, and then going deeper over time. And if you can articulate the business benefits associated with doing that as well, for example, your brand resilience, your reputational resilience, and even operational efficiencies, then that will help you secure sustained internal commitment throughout this process. Next, you should be mapping your supply chain, and we'll come back to this in a bit more detail in a second because it's a really interesting step to take. But basically, identify that low-hanging fruit. So where can you have the most impact with the least resistance? For example, maybe you have a really highly emitting supplier who might be willing to pilot low carbon shipping, or a region where worker representation can be strengthened with a good code of conduct, or by completing an SAQ and allowing you transparency over that data. Next, it's really important to engage your suppliers, not just audit them. So due diligence is about building shared responsibility, and we encourage our clients to engage suppliers in practical conversations about risks, constraints, and improvements that can be made. So consider capacity building or joint initiatives or shared training, especially where leverage is low or your suppliers are critical to your business. That can be really effective and low cost, and giving your suppliers a platform to learn from each other as well can be a really effective way of improving engagement. Next, make it operational. So execute a really strong plan with actions, timelines, ownership and KPIs. Make sure that it's resourced, whether that's for time, for staff, or for travel, or for tools that you might need. And then align this with other business systems. And I'll come back to how you can do that in a second. And then finally, although as James said, it is a cycle, so you will hopefully come back to this time and time again, but it's really important to monitor what you're doing and improve continuously. Due diligence isn't a tick box exercise, it is a cycle. And so it's important to establish a rhythm of monitoring, evaluation and adjustment, using data and feedback from your suppliers to refine your priorities. And we really encourage companies to be transparent about their progress and their gaps, as that's how you build trust with your stakeholders. And then at the bottom, you can see here a kind of cross-cutting initiative is to ensure that you consider grievance mechanisms and access to remedy for workers, as that is a crucial part of the OECD steps, and one that you should be considering really at each stage of your due diligence roadmap. So to wrap up this part of the webinar, we've got the main message being that due diligence isn't about perfection, it's about taking a proactive, structured approach and making sure that responsibility is assigned at each step. You can start small, but we think you should start now because expectations are rising, and those companies who act early will be the ones who will be able to shape that standard. So I will hand back to James now to dive a bit more into some of these individual steps.
Thanks, Miranda. So if we go into the next slide, please. So yes, as Miranda mentioned, before you start acting, it's good to clarify expectations and standards in a policy or multiple policies focusing on distinct issues. So this is just kind of an overview of 6 steps which are helpful when creating an effective due diligence policy. And so if we focus on that first step, that's to understand the context that your business operates within. So it's useful to conduct a risk and opportunity assessment to help identify the key sustainability risks and opportunities that are kind of inherent to your sector and your operations within your supply chain. Then it's also useful to look at your legislative and customer requirements as well. Yes, to understand kind of the benchmarks there and make sure that that's incorporated within your standards to support compliance with them. And thirdly, it's also useful to map stakeholders if needed. So this can include internal and external parties. So for example, suppliers, investors, communities or regulators even, just so that the standards that you set out in the policies work for all the relevant groups. Then once you've kind of understood that context, it's useful to do a review of your existing policies to evaluate what's already in place, including ESG related procedures, codes of conduct, procurement standards as well, just to make sure that you can streamline standards and ensure that there aren't overlapping standards which may be saying different things. Then once you've done that, it's useful to define the policy objectives and scope. So the purpose of the policy, why is this due diligence policy necessary? For example, is it to prevent environmental harm, labour rights violations, reputational damage? And then the scope, so what operations and parts of the supply chain will it cover? For example, will it focus on direct operations? Will it focus on tier 1 suppliers, or go further down the supply chain in that sense as well? Then once you've done that, it's useful to update commitments and promote alignment. So that's promoting alignment with international frameworks like the OECD guidelines, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and also, legislation that we mentioned before, which could be kind of region-wide, such as CSRD or EU CSDDD as well, where applicable. And then that fifth step is including supplier requirements. So when you're creating a supplier-facing policy, it's important to clearly lay out the expectations and standards for your suppliers. And you can do this, for example, in a supplier code of conduct. Ideally, all suppliers would read and sign this policy, and you can kind of promote that by embedding this into procurement processes, such as making it a requirement at the pre-tender stage, if appropriate. And then finally, review grievance mechanisms. So it's important to review the grievance mechanisms that your suppliers have, and the standards and expectations for what this should include should be set out within a policy as well. And it should be that a requirement for suppliers to have a grievance mechanism that's aligned with the appropriate standards that your business expects. And then once you've kind of, created that policy in this way, the next phase after setting the policy is monitoring compliance with it. And this can include establishing a monitoring and evaluation framework, including performance metrics with specific KPIs, as well as promoting regular communication, feedback mechanisms, and capacity building and support with suppliers where needed as well. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So once you set out your expectations within the relevant policies, then it's useful to start mapping your supply chain, because you can't manage what you don't have visibility of. So why is this important? Well, mapping your supply chain can help to identify ESG risks, like the ones highlighted on the slide here, deforestation or forced labor. They help you improve traceability, which supports compliance with laws such as CSDDD or UFLPA that we've already mentioned. And they can also help you prepare for sustainability reporting. So this could be mandatory reporting under CSRD, or it could be your Scope 3 emissions reporting as well. And how to do this? So often we advise clients to kind of start with the tier 1, so their direct suppliers, as it's easier to gather the information at this level. But it's important to bear in mind that the risks are actually likely to kind of exist further up the supply chain upstream, due to and they'll be higher at like the raw material level, as this is where you're likely to have less visibility as well. So once you have started with your tier 1 suppliers, it's useful to conduct inherent risk assessment. So this is based on the geography of those suppliers, as well as the commodities that they're supplying. And then once you've understood that can help you to prioritize high-risk geographies and high-risk commodities as well. And the SEDEX platform has that inherent data to help you do this. Then once you've kind of understood the inherent risk within your tier 1, or your suppliers closer to your own operations, then you can start to expand further upstream to tier 2, 3, and 4. And then you can also start drilling down to supplier level risk. So to understand more supplier level risk, it's useful to send out supplier questionnaires. So, for example, the SEDEX on the SEDEX platform, you have different types of SAQs, including a goods provider SAQ, a service provider SAQ, and an environmental SAQ, which is a little bit more focused on the environmental side of things. And this helps kind of collect information, including business details, locations, product inputs, as well as ESG practices. But it also can help cascade that information down your supply chain, so it helps you understand your sub-tier suppliers as well. And the benefit of the SEDEX platform is that all that information is centralized onto that platform, and completion levels of different questionnaires for individual suppliers is also highlighted, so you can track progress. Then, once you've got that inherent information, as well as that information from those supplier questionnaires, that can give you an indication and a way to start building a risk profile. And then with those high risk suppliers, you might want to start conducting site audits. So SEDEX has SMETA, which is the world's most widely used social audit methodology. And this is comprised of 4 pillars, which center around labor standards, health and safety, environment, and business ethics. And it incorporates accepted kind of ethical trade practices and guidelines. For example, it referenced the Ethical Trading Initiative base code, so the ETI base code. And so that's just one methodology you can use. And that then will allow you to understand kind of where your non-compliances are. So when a supplier isn't kind of up to scratch, they'll get a non-compliance. And this will kind of also be graded on the SEDEX platform. So that will help you prioritize your non-compliances based on whether the issue is business critical, major, or minor. And then alongside these non-compliances, you'll also get supplier corrective action plans. And so that you can work with your suppliers using these corrective action plans to close those non-compliances. And the platform will also help you track your progress in terms of closed and open non-compliances. In the consulting team, we can also help build with a risk assessment and supply prioritization matrix and help you with standard operating procedures as well, which could include governance processes and escalation mechanisms in case of non-compliance to help standardize those processes and kind of complement your use of the platform. Now I'll hand over back to Miranda to discuss management systems.
Thanks, James. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I said earlier, we want to make sure that due diligence process is continuous and cyclical and not just a tick box exercise. So you can see here some examples of how this could be integrated into your current systems to make sure that it's not just a kind of add-on or a bolt-on. So procurement, obviously crucial for requesting data early during onboarding, tendering, or contracting, and making sure that supplier expectations are clearly communicated. Legal teams can make a big difference by embedding human rights and environmental expectations into contract clauses and supplier codes. And they're also key to ensuring compliance with regulations like the EU CS-DDD. Finance teams can help identify gaps between the data that you need and what you actually have, especially as new reporting requirements come in. And they're also critical for budgeting and resourcing your due diligence activities. HR can also support due diligence in labour supply chains, especially when reviewing temporary labour providers or recruitment agents. This is essential in preventing risks like forced labour or recruitment fees. Contracted labour can be a big source of hidden risks, even in low-risk locations, and their workers are often not protected by labour laws. And finally, we have their account management, often overlooked, but they also play a gatekeeping role as they field your customer requests and often pass on supplier data. And so it's important that they know what to look for and when to escalate requests or concerns. On the right-hand side of the slide, we've outlined 5 key principles for integrating due diligence systematically. So firstly, assign clear roles and responsibilities across departments to make sure that due diligence becomes a shared task, as somebody has to own each part for it all to work. Next, embed it into your supplier selection and onboarding. Don't make it a late-stage bolt-on. Integrate into contracts and supplier codes so that obligations are binding, not just nice to have. And connect it to risk management so that due diligence feeds into your broader enterprise risk assessments. And then finally, link it to KPIs and reporting. So to summarize, effective due diligence isn't just a checklist, it's a system of actions owned across your teams and aligned to your business goals. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So specifically, how can SEDEX support you with all of this? So SEDEX helps you map your supplier base and assess inherent ESG risk, as James was telling us, based on factors like geography, sector, and workforce characteristics. Once you've mapped the risk, the SAQ captures critical site-level data from suppliers, including policies, practices, and performance indicators. Then you can assess what the data is telling you. So this is where SEDEX helps you go beyond just collecting information, but enables automated risk scoring and dashboards to guide prioritization for due diligence. And self-reported data is, of course, useful. It's critical to helping you narrow down your risk assessments and to improve visibility of those risks in your supply chain and at your supplier sites, but it also needs verification. So SEDEX supports validation through third-party audits to build greater confidence in your supplier performance. Then you can turn these insights into actions. So through reporting and benchmarking that helps teams across procurement, legal, and sustainability to make their informed decisions. Finally, this is not a one and done process. SEDEX supports ongoing supplier engagement, helping you to close risk gaps, improve performance, and build stronger, more resilient supply chains over time. So all of this is supported through consulting, that's our team, supplier engagement services, sustainable trade coordination, and APIs to help integrate due diligence into your broader business systems.
Super. Thank you very much, Miranda. Thank you, James. Just a reminder for our live listeners, if you have any questions that you would like to ask live, there's a question mark. You'll be able to submit us a question and we can ask it live to our panel. We've got a couple here already. So let me start off with this one. I'm struggling with unresponsive suppliers. How would you recommend to overcome this? James, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. I would say the first stage is probably identifying kind of the root cause of the unresponsiveness. So kind of engaging the supplier to understand, is it a lack of understanding? Do they just have limited resources? Are they kind of fearing exposure of the poor performance as well? That's potentially poor sustainability performance. Is it potentially also a misalignment of priorities and values? Are they not so concerned with sustainability? Then once you kind of understood that reasoning, you can then do things such as kind of strengthen the value proposition for your supplier. So that might be things like highlighting the mutual benefits, such as access to future contracts that this could open their door to, reduce risk for them, and also like improve competitiveness, or and emphasize also like that there's regulatory and customer-driven pressures as well. And then you can do things to help them respond as well. So you can simplify the request by breaking it down into kind of more manageable tasks, or by providing templates, or you could use incentivization, such as designing supplier engagement tiers like gold, silver, or bronze that help kind of recognize suppliers and their cooperation. But overall, I guess I just say, yeah, we would encourage increased communication, and if needed, even capacity building in the form of kind of training or workshops, or just sharing best practices, because suppliers often want to do the best thing as they want your business. So you should help them just to do that.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. There's another question here. I'm linked to some strategic suppliers on SEDEX. How do I know how to prioritize for onboarding next? James, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can also take that one. Thanks, Tom. So I think the first stage here is kind of, you need to prioritize your suppliers. And to do that, first step is often conducting a supplier risk assessment. So as we mentioned, that can be based on things like geographic risk and an industry as well. So that inherent risk profile. And then you can also look at kind of products and service risk as well, so commodity risk. You could also here look at, for example, past performance as well, so history of non-compliances or audit failures potentially. Then I'd probably say once you've got that kind of base level of understanding, you could overlay that with strategic factors as well. So you can focus on suppliers that are, for example, high spend or critical to operations. You can also look at like sole sourcing suppliers, or ones that might be hard to replace. And then kind of plot these on a risk impact matrix. So you can have top priority for onboarding, medium priority, and low priority. And then leverage your influence that you might have to kind of it might be easier to onboard certain suppliers because you might have more leverage there in terms of contractual, commercial, reputational reasonings. And then just to phase out that rollout plan, starting with those high risk, high impact suppliers, and then expanding as you go.
Super, thank you very much. I think we've got a question here from Miranda. So I'm preparing for EU CSDDD, but I'm confused about Omnibus. Can SEDEX support to comply with this legislation?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So I mentioned it earlier, and it's definitely an ongoing topic of conversation that we're having with our clients. So I think it's today or this week that the latest round of the simplified ESRS is being discussed by the European Commission, and that will go through the process to be published in October, hopefully. We currently don't know where they're going to land with it. We hear arguments on both sides that it could be made, there are calls for it to be brought back up to a higher standard. There's obviously significant political pressure for the law to be rolled back and for it to be kept at the omnibus proposal level that it is at the moment. In terms of companies preparing to comply, we would recommend that you at least plot out a roadmap that would be aligned with good practice for your sector. So, look at the OECD guidance, assess your risks, figure out what a risk-based approach would look like, and just get started, because you're probably already behind, to be honest, if you haven't started doing this. And then hopefully when the omnibus, the final version of the EU CSDDD is published, you will be able to have some clarity on exactly what compliance would look like for you, or what it would look like for your customers if you're a big manufacturer supplying the retailers. So I would get started with some sort of roadmap, figure out what good would look like for you, figure out how much it's going to cost you, and what it means for your teams and for your stakeholders. And then you can look at what just compliance would look like when you've got some clarity from the EU. If you have any more questions on that, then please do reach out and we can help you with that in more detail.
Amazing. Thank you both. I think that's all of the questions for today. So I'd just like to thank our presenters, Miranda and James, and also thanking the viewers as well who attended today. If you have any questions, obviously, please get in touch at consulting@sedex.com, or you can visit our website, sedex.com. I hope you have a lovely day, and thank you very much for your time. Take care.